I bought the cabin for silence, but the morning I arrived and found my gate sealed shut, I realized someone else thought they owned more than they did. The cabin sat exactly where I wanted it, far from traffic, tucked into a tree line with a narrow gravel road winding up from the valley. It wasn't fancy. One structure, a locked gate, and land that had been surveyed, recorded, and paid for years ago. I didn't visit often, which was part of the appeal. When I did, it was to unplug, not to deal with people. That's why the concrete stopped me cold. Where the gate used to swing open, there was now a thick slab poured directly across the entrance. Fresh, still curring. Someone hadn't just blocked it, they'd made sure it wasn't going anywhere. A metal notice was bolted into the concrete, stamped with the seal of a neighborhood association I didn't recognize. According to the notice, access was restricted pending compliance. Compliance with what exactly wasn't clear. I checked my maps first, then my documents, then the survey markers I knew by memory. Everything lined up exactly as it always had. The gate was mine, the land was mine, and the road leading to it, quiet, overlooked, and easy to ignore, was also mine. I took photos, lots of them, the concrete, the notice, the road, the surrounding markers. I didn't touch anything. I didn't break the seal. I didn't call anyone yet. Instead, I walked the length of the access road all the way down to where it met the larger development below. That's when things started to make sense. Below my property sat a small cluster of homes governed by that same association. Neat fences, uniform mailboxes, perfectly trimmed edges. And one critical detail that most people would miss if they weren't looking for it. The only paved road in or out passed directly through my land before connecting to the main highway. They hadn't built a second exit. They hadn't secured an easement. They had assumed. Later that afternoon, I finally reached out. I was told the gate had been sealed for safety reasons, that my cabin was non-compliant, that I'd been notified, though no one could say when or how. The tone was firm, rehearsed, confident. I asked a single question, under what authority? The line went quiet for a second too long. They told me we'd discuss it later. I drove back down the road as the sun dipped behind the hills, passing every driveway that depended on that narrow strip of land. I didn't block anything. I didn't post signs. I didn't argue. I just smiled. Because sealing my gate was loud. And what I planned to do next didn't require a sound. They thought concrete gave them control, but they hadn't realized what that road actually meant. When someone blocks your property without permission, you don't argue. You document, wait, and let them explain themselves. I didn't rush to fix the gate. I didn't chip away the concrete or demand immediate access. The seal told me everything I needed to know. They were acting first and checking later. That kind of confidence usually means someone skipped a step. I reviewed every file tied to the property. Deeds, boundary maps, access descriptions. The road wasn't just adjacent to my land, it was carved into it. Recorded that way. Maintained that way, never transferred, never shared, no easement filed, no conditional use agreement, nothing. That explained why the association's notice was so vague. They weren't citing law. They were asserting control and hoping no one would challenge it. I reached out again, this time asking for the specific regulation I'd violated. The response was polished but empty, references to community standards, mentions of safety review. Not a single statute, not a single clause, just authority without foundation. Meanwhile, I started noticing small changes down the road. Vehicles slowed near my gate. A few residents walked past, eyeing the concrete barrier like it was new. And it was. I overheard someone say the association had finally handled the cabin issue. That phrasing stuck with me. They hadn't handled anything. They'd escalated it. Instead of responding emotionally, I hired a local surveyor to verify the access route one more time. Not because I doubted it, but because I wanted a fresh, independent record dated after the gate was sealed. The report came back clean. The road, the gate, the land, it was all indisputably mine. I forwarded a copy to the association with a short note requesting removal of the obstruction. No threats, no deadlines, just facts. Their reply came quickly and defensively. They insisted the road had always been treated as shared access. That phrase again, treated as, not recorded as, not granted as, assumption masquerading as entitlement. I asked them to provide the easement paperwork. They couldn't. Instead, they asked for a meeting. That was when I realized something important. They didn't expect resistance. They expected me to negotiate, maybe compromise, maybe ask permission to access my own land. What they didn't expect was someone willing to wait, so I waited. The gate stayed sealed. The road stayed open. Life below continued exactly as before, every car passing over land they didn't legally have the right to use. I didn't interfere, because interference would have helped them. Silence wouldn't. And the longer they ignored my documents, the more valuable that quiet road became. The moment they stopped answering my emails was the moment I knew they'd finally checked the records and didn't like what they saw. The meeting they requested never happened. Instead, responses slowed, then stopped altogether. No follow-up, no paperwork, no explanation, just silence. The kind of silence that usually follows an uncomfortable discovery. Down the hill, things carried on as normal. Cars came and went. Deliveries rolled through. Contractors passed daily. Every single one of them used the same stretch of road, the one the association had never questioned, never verified, and never owned. I kept my routine unchanged. I didn't post warnings. I didn't block access. I didn't confront residents who had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. None of this was their fault. The mistake sat higher up the chain. A week later, I received a formal letter. It was carefully worded and impressively vague. The association claimed the gate had been sealed due to potential liability concerns, and that they were reviewing historical access arrangements. They asked for time. No apology, no acknowledgement of error, just delay. That was fine with me, because time worked in my favor. I asked my legal advisor a simple question. What happens if they never had permission to use that road? The answer was short. Then every use of it is conditional on your tolerance. That changed the math entirely. I documented everything. Dates, letters, photos, the concrete barrier, the association seal, the continued use of the road. I wasn't building a case to argue, I was building a record to present. A second letter arrived, this one less confident. They suggested mediation. They floated the idea of formalizing access moving forward. Still no mention of removing the concrete. Still no explanation for how it got there in the first place. They were trying to skip to the solution without acknowledging the problem. I declined mediation, not because I wanted conflict, but because mediation assumes equal standing. We didn't have that. One party had acted without authority. The other had simply noticed. Meanwhile, the sealed gate became a talking point. Residents speculated. Some assumed I'd violated rules. Others wondered why the association looked so tense during meetings. Rumors spread faster than facts, and the association didn't correct them. They couldn't, because the truth was worse. They had restricted access to property they didn't control, while depending entirely on a road they didn't own. And every day that passed without resolution made that contradiction harder to explain. I didn't need to apply pressure. Their own structure was doing that for me. And when the association finally realized how exposed they were, their next move made the situation irreversible. When an organization realizes it's standing on ground it doesn't own, panic tends to arrive disguised as urgency. The shift was obvious. What started as silence turned into a flurry of messages marked time-sensitive. The association suddenly wanted cooperation. They framed it as a mutual misunderstanding, something best resolved quickly and quietly. Their tone had changed, but their approach hadn't. They still avoided admitting fault. They proposed a temporary solution first. The gate, they said, could remain sealed for now, but access to the cabin would be coordinated through them. A schedule, a contact person, oversight, as if permission flowed downward from their office instead of outward from my deed. I declined. The next proposal was more revealing. They suggested formalizing a permanent easement for the road, retroactively. The paperwork they attached was drafted as if the road had always been shared and just needed updating. It carefully avoided mentioning the concrete barrier, the notice, or the lack of prior consent. That omission told me everything. They weren't trying to correct a mistake. They were trying to rewrite it. I responded with a single-page letter. No emotion, no accusations, just 3 attachments: the original deed, the updated survey, and a time-stamped photo of the sealed gate. I asked them to explain in writing how those 3 things could coexist with their actions. They didn't answer that question. Instead, they escalated. A legal notice arrived claiming the gate closure was justified under emergency authority, and that reopening it without approval could expose me to liability. The language was aggressive, designed to intimidate rather than clarify. It might have worked on someone unfamiliar with their own rights. It didn't work on me. I forwarded the notice to my legal advisor, who laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was careless. Emergency authority doesn't apply to private land without imminent risk. And even if it did, it doesn't extend indefinitely, and it certainly doesn't involve pouring concrete. More importantly, their notice created a paper trail, one that acknowledged the gate, the road, and their unilateral action. They'd put it in writing. Down the hill, residents started noticing delays. Service vehicles were asking questions. A delivery truck got turned around after being warned there might be an access issue. The association tried to reassure everyone, but uncertainty has a way of leaking. And uncertainty travels fast. I still didn't touch the road. I didn't block it. I didn't gate it. I didn't even post a sign. Because the association was already doing my work for me, drawing attention to a problem they couldn't explain without admitting the truth. They thought pressure would force me to fold. What it actually did was lock them into a position they couldn't defend. Because once authority puts its mistake in writing, the clock starts ticking, and there's no way to rewind it. The moment they involved outside counsel, I knew this was no longer about control. It was about survival. The tone shifted again, this time noticeably restrained. Messages became shorter. Words were chosen carefully. Every sentence sounded like it had been reviewed twice before being sent. The association had brought in legal representation, and with that came a new problem for them. Lawyers read deeds. Their counsel requested documentation, politely. Ownership records, surveys, access descriptions. I provided everything promptly, exactly as filed and recorded. No commentary, no interpretation, just facts. Clean, verifiable, and inconvenient. A few days passed before I heard back. When the response came, it avoided substance. Instead of addressing ownership or authority, they asked about long-term intentions for the land. Whether I planned to develop it, whether I'd consider selling, whether I'd be open to collaborative solutions. It was a pivot. They weren't defending their actions anymore. They were trying to escape their consequences. I replied just as simply, my intentions were irrelevant. What mattered was what had already happened. My gate sealed without consent, my access restricted, and my property treated as communal without any legal basis. That's when the calls started. Not from the association directly, but from intermediaries. People offering to facilitate conversations, suggesting compromises, hinting that prolonged disputes could create inconvenience for everyone involved. The message was clear without being stated outright: make this go away. I declined every invitation. Meanwhile, the sealed gate remained untouched. The concrete began to weather, turning from fresh gray to dull and permanent looking. Ironically, it had become a symbol, not of authority, but of overreach. Residents below noticed more than just tension. Insurance questions surfaced. Contractors asked whether access would remain open. A few homeowners quietly reached out to ask if there was something they should know. I didn't answer them directly, not because I wanted to scare anyone, but because clarity had to come from the source that caused the problem. And that source was running out of explanations. Then came the letter that changed everything. The association's council formally acknowledged that no recorded easement existed for the road. The admission was buried in careful language, but it was there. They claimed reliance on historical use and assumed continuity, but assumptions don't transfer rights. That single sentence shifted the entire balance, because now it wasn't my word against theirs. It was their admission against the record. They had sealed my gate without authority, and they had done it while depending entirely on my land. And once that admission existed, every option they had left became more expensive than the last. Admissions don't feel dangerous when they're written carefully, but once they exist, they can't be taken back. The association tried to walk it back, not directly, of course. They reframed the admission as a technical clarification, suggesting that paperwork could be corrected after the fact. They emphasized cooperation, community harmony, and the importance of moving forward together. But forward only works when both parties start from the truth. I asked a single follow-up question. If there was no easement, under what authority had they sealed my gate? That question went unanswered. Instead, they proposed a settlement draft. It outlined a permanent access agreement in exchange for removing the concrete and mutual release of claims. On paper, it looked reasonable, until you noticed what it quietly required me to give up. Control. The draft granted the association broad rights to maintain, regulate, and modify the road at their discretion. It shifted liability. It locked in access permanently. And it framed the entire situation as a cooperative resolution rather than a correction of wrongful action. They wanted me to legitimize the mistake. I declined again. This time, I didn't need to explain why. Because events were already moving. Local officials began asking questions, not because I'd called them, but because insurance carriers had. When access routes become uncertain, liability follows. And when liability appears, paperwork gets reviewed quickly. The association was now dealing with more than one problem. They had restricted private property without authority. They had no legal access route. And they had created a paper trail that raised red flags outside their control. They requested another meeting. I agreed, but on my terms, no mediation, no compromise language. Just a formal session to discuss removal of the obstruction and restoration of access. I didn't ask for damages. I didn't threaten action. I simply asked for my gate back. They arrived defensive and left quiet. Because once the facts were laid out, cleanly, calmly, and without embellishment, there was nothing left to argue. The law wasn't ambiguous. The records weren't unclear. The only uncertainty was how long they could delay before consequences escalated further. The next day, contractors arrived at my gate, not to pour more concrete, to break it up. I watched from a distance as the barrier was removed piece by piece. No announcement, no apology, just quiet correction. The notice disappeared with it. They restored the gate exactly as it had been, as if trying to erase the moment entirely. But erasing the moment didn't erase the record, because even after the concrete was gone, the road and what it represented was still entirely in my hands. They thought removing the concrete would reset everything, but once leverage is revealed, it never disappears. The gate swung open again, smooth and silent like it always had. From a distance, you'd never know anything had happened. No barrier, no notice, no sign of conflict. That, I think, was exactly what the association hoped for, that the problem would fade the moment it stopped being visible. But visibility was never the issue. The issue was reliance. Every car that passed along that narrow road was a reminder of how fragile their position had been, and still was. The association had corrected the immediate mistake, but the underlying reality hadn't changed. They still didn't own the road. They still didn't have an easement, and now they knew I knew. Communication resumed cautiously, messages framed as check-ins, questions about maintenance schedules, suggestions for open dialogue. None of it mentioned the gate. None of it acknowledged the overreach. It was as if they hoped politeness could substitute for resolution. I kept my responses brief and factual. I wasn't interested in leverage for its own sake. I wasn't looking to punish anyone. But I also wasn't going to pretend the situation had never occurred. The road required clarity, formal, recorded, and accurate. A few residents approached me directly while I was on the property. They were respectful, curious, and clearly unaware of the details. I explained only what was necessary, that there had been a misunderstanding and it had been resolved. That was true, just not complete. Behind the scenes, the association continued trying to normalize access through informal behavior, routine maintenance, occasional signage, subtle signals of ownership without documentation. It was quiet but intentional. So I made my position equally quiet and unmistakable. I commissioned a formal boundary marker installation along the road. Subtle, clean, fully compliant, not obstructive. Just visible enough to remind anyone paying attention where the land actually belonged. No gates, no barriers, just facts placed in the ground. The association noticed immediately. Another letter arrived, this one far more careful than the first. It acknowledged my ownership explicitly and requested renewed discussion about access rights. The tone wasn't demanding anymore. It was cautious, almost deferential. That's what clarity does. It doesn't escalate conflict. It ends assumptions. I didn't rush to respond. Because for the first time since the concrete appeared, the pressure wasn't on me to act. It was on them. They could continue operating under uncertainty, or they could finally address the issue properly. Either way, the choice and the timeline were no longer theirs to control. And when authority loses the ability to assume, every future decision becomes a negotiation it can't avoid. Uncertainty makes organizations nervous, but finality terrifies them. Weeks passed without incident, and that quiet did more to reshape the situation than any argument ever could. The association stopped acting as if the road was theirs. Maintenance vehicles hesitated. New signage proposals stalled. Every decision now came with a pause, a review, a question that hadn't existed before. Who actually has the right to do this? That question changes behavior. Eventually, the association requested a formal resolution, again. This time, the language was different. No assumptions, no historical claims. Just acknowledgement of ownership and a request to negotiate limited access under clearly defined terms. That was progress. I agreed to talk, not because I felt pressured, but because clarity benefits everyone. But I set boundaries from the start. Any agreement would be narrow. No blanket rights, no permanent transfer of control. Access would exist only as long as conditions were met and could be revoked if they weren't. They hesitated, because what they wanted was certainty without accountability, and what I offered was the opposite. During the discussion, it became clear how deep the initial mistake had gone. Previous board members had relied on verbal assurances, old maps, informal understandings passed down without verification. Over time, those assumptions hardened into belief, and belief became policy, until someone checked. They asked why I hadn't blocked the road earlier before things escalated. I told them the truth. Blocking it would have hurt people who had nothing to do with the decision. This wasn't about disruption, it was about correction. That answer landed. The final proposal they brought forward was the first one that made sense. A revocable access agreement, clear maintenance responsibilities, explicit acknowledgement of ownership, no retroactive claims, no rewriting history. It didn't erase what happened, but it prevented it from happening again. I reviewed it carefully, made revisions, removed unnecessary language, clarified enforcement. And when it was done, it reflected reality instead of assumption. We signed. The association recorded the agreement properly this time. Notices were updated, internal policies revised, and the sealed gate incident quietly disappeared from public discussion, replaced by a new understanding everyone could actually stand on. I returned to the cabin more often after that, not because I needed to monitor anything, but because the land felt like mine again. Unquestioned, unchallenged, undermined no longer by someone else's confidence. The road stayed open. The gate stayed free, and everything worked because it was finally built on truth. But the real lesson wasn't about land or gates, it was about what happens when authority forgets to verify. People assume the story ends when paperwork is signed, but the real impact shows up in what never happens again. After the agreement was recorded, life below the cabin returned to normal, or at least, what passed for normal before assumptions took over. Vehicles moved freely. Maintenance happened on schedule. Meetings resumed without tension hanging in the air. From the outside, it looked like a quiet resolution. But internally, things had changed. The association became careful, painfully careful. Every decision involving property lines, access, or enforcement now went through verification. Surveys were checked. Records were pulled. Legal language replaced casual phrases like "everyone knows" and "it's always been this way." That shift didn't come from policy training. It came from embarrassment. The sealed gate incident became an unspoken reference point, not mentioned directly but always understood. Whenever a board member suggested taking action on something that wasn't clearly theirs, someone would pause and ask, "Do we actually own that?" That question alone prevented countless future conflicts. For me, the experience reinforced something I'd always believed but never had to prove so clearly. Ownership isn't just about holding land, it's about knowing it. Knowing the boundaries, knowing the records, knowing when to stay quiet and let others expose their own mistakes. People asked why I hadn't pushed for penalties or compensation, why I didn't escalate further once the leverage was obvious. The answer was simple. I didn't need to. The outcome mattered more than the spectacle. My access was restored. My rights were acknowledged. And the association learned a lesson that would outlast any fine or headline. Sometimes restraint is the strongest position. I still visit the cabin regularly. The road remains unchanged, winding through the trees like it always has. The gate opens without resistance. No notices, no concrete, no assumptions, just quiet. Every now and then I'll see a new face down the hill, A new homeowner, unfamiliar with the history. They'll pass along the road without a second thought, unaware of how close that access came to becoming a legal nightmare. And that's fine. The goal was never to be remembered. It was to be respected, on paper and in practice. Because the final outcome wasn't about winning, it was about making sure the same mistake could never happen again. Looking back, the most surprising part wasn't the conflict. It was how easily it could have been avoided. If there's one takeaway from everything that happened, it's this. Most problems don't start with bad intentions. They start with unchecked assumptions. Somewhere along the line, someone decided the road must be shared. Someone else treated that idea as fact. And eventually, that belief hardened into action, concrete and all. The sealed gate wasn't the cause of the conflict. It was the symptom. What followed proved something important. Authority without verification isn't authority at all. It's just confidence wearing a badge. And confidence collapses the moment records are opened, maps are reviewed, and facts are placed side by side. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was patient. I didn't rush to confront. I didn't escalate emotionally. I didn't make threats or draw lines that couldn't be walked back. I let the process work exactly the way it's designed to, slowly, methodically, and anchored in documentation. That approach won't make headlines. It doesn't look dramatic. But it works. The gate stands open today not because someone was punished, but because someone finally admitted they were wrong. The road remains accessible not because it was taken, but because it was properly understood. And the association operates more carefully now, not out of fear, but out of awareness. That's the real outcome. When systems learn, everyone benefits. If you're dealing with a situation where authority seems misplaced or where decisions are being made without clarity, remember this story. You don't always need to fight. Sometimes you just need to know your ground, literally and figuratively. Let records speak. Let silence work, and let assumptions collapse under their own weight. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. If you found this story useful or thought-provoking, subscribe to the channel for more real-world situations where patience beats pressure. Don't forget to like the video and comment your thoughts below. I'd love to hear how you would have handled it.